In today's Lightroom tutorial, I'm going to take this very dramatic long exposure RAW file from the Basel train station in Switzerland, and I'm going to turn it into a photo like this at the end. And I really want to share my tips and techniques with you that I use when editing pictures like this. I'm going to quickly make this picture a bit brighter temporarily so you can see all of the details. And the thing with these kind of pictures, now here you have these very dramatic stormy clouds. This was, by the way, just minutes before it started to pour rain. And you also have these rails and these trains on the foreground, which make it look a little bit more industrial. So all of this together, I really think it's very important to still remain this very dark, gloomy and overall dramatic mood, and not go too bright and make just everything very boring and kind of, you know, not as strong as it would be if it would be darker. So what I'm actually gonna do here is raise the shadows by quite a bit, so I still do have some of the shadow details, and I also gonna bring up the exposure just a tad bit, maybe by like 1/5 of a stop. And that is just so we have a nice starting base. Now here it's not too dark, it's not too bright, and that is exactly what you want. It might seem a little bit dark at the start, but believe me, if you do have a picture like this, really the worst thing that you can do is just make it super bright and make it lose all of its character. I'm just gonna reset that and go on with the further editing. Now here I'm definitely gonna bring down the highlights just to equivalate out the overall exposure in the sky. And especially if you have kind of a long exposure with clouds like this, where you have kind of a darker part, you have a brighter part here and there, then bringing up the whites can have a huge impact on overall dynamic. And it's always a good idea to hold down the Alt key and just stop before anything clips in the picture. So if you start to get anything else than black, that means that particular area is clipped, and you still want all of the highlight detail, despite making it a little bit more interesting and a little bit more dramatic. So here's before the whites, here's after, really a huge difference in the sky, but also within the foregrounds it does have a little bit of an impact. And then with the blacks, here you can actually go either way. You can make it even more dark, even more dramatic, but if you already have a very dramatic and very dark picture like this, it is very, very easy to make it look too much and really clip all of the shadows, which is not really something you want. So the thing actually I'm gonna do here is bring up the blacks a little bit, and in exchange for that I'm gonna bring the contrast to the right. And contrast is also, it kind of makes the dark parts a little bit darker, but at the same time it just gives a punch to the overall picture and just contrast, which I really think works well. And by bringing up the blacks a little bit, maybe even mixing that and fine-tuning it with the shadows, I still can do all of that while still remaining this shadow detail. So then, in terms of the clarity, now here I do have a trick, and that is first of all go into the +100 clarity and then go into the -100 clarity. And the reason you want to do that is because a lot of people just tend to go into the plus clarity no matter what. And the thing is, in a lot of pictures, it actually works better to go into the minus clarity overall and then go into the local adjustments and just add some clarities in local parts. And if I once again show you the extreme example here, as you can see, we really have a lot of textures with the trains, with the cables and whatever, and it really pronounces everything way too much and it makes it look a little bit too harsh. Because clarity essentially is just a very minor and very fine contrast. So if I show you the opposite and go into the minus clarity, you can see it's much more smooth and much more pleasing to look at if you ask me. So I don't want to go -100. This is really just the extreme example to decide which way you want to go. Instead, I'm just going to bring that up to around -25 and then later on go into the local adjustments after I'm done with all of the global adjustments and just add some clarity in some local areas. So very important here that you do not only go into the plus clarity, but also see what the minus clarity does to your picture. Now, in terms of vibrance and saturation, I do think that this picture is already, very vibrant. I like the color in the sky because it's very blue, and I definitely could make it very neutralish, but that would be almost boring if you ask me. And the thing is, if you have kind of overcast, dark, gloomy, or even night pictures, I really think it works well to go for an overall bluish look. And if you then decide to add a little bit of warm tones in the foreground or wherever, you can always do that later on, but I really like this very, very bluish tone at the start, because it just makes it look so much more cold and dramatic in my opinion. So I'm gonna go quite a bit into the blues here, and just leave it at around 5000. And tint, maybe I'm just gonna add a little bit of magenta because it seems like there was just a hint of green. And back down to vibrance and saturation, even though the sky is very blue, I do like that, and the foreground isn't super saturated, but it's an overcast picture, and in the foreground right here, I do think it works a lot better if it's not super saturated. It just looks a lot more natural. Let's go down into the tonal curve, and usually I really like to bring up the highlight slider because it affects the very bright highlights in your picture other than the highlight slider right here, which will just affect the overall bright parts. But in this case you can see it really just affects these kind of spots right here, which is not something I really want, so I'm just gonna leave it at 0 for this particular picture. And with the other sliders, it's very important to just look at the dynamic of the overall picture and not so much at the exposure. Because for example, here with the lights, by bringing that one to the right, this is just kind of an extreme example, it does make the picture, especially the sky, a lot more interesting, but it also makes it a little bit too bright. But by bringing down the lights, it makes it a lot better in terms of the exposure, but it also takes away a lot of the dynamic, interest and differentiation. So it's very important to just look at the differentiation and go for that, because exposure is always very, very easily fixed with the graduated filter, Radial filter, adjustment brush. It's always very, very easy to be done, but the tonal curve is really all about the differentiation and dynamic. And the darks and the lights are kind of like a medium in between the highlight and shadow sliders in the tonal curve and the shadow and highlight slider in the basic adjustments. So once again, I'm just going to quickly go over them. The highlight slider in the basic adjustments will just kind of affect your very broad and very general bright areas in your picture, and the shadows will do the exact same thing, just with the shadow parts. And then in the tonal curve, you have, first of all, the highlight slider, which does the, just the very, very bright parts of your picture, as you can see here. And you also have the shadows, which are just the equivalent of that, with the shadow parts. As you can see here, it really has a huge impact. And then the lights and the dark slider, it's just kind of the in-between all of that. It's a very subtle adjustment most of the time, with mostly affecting the midtones. So once again, I'm also going to move around these sliders. By the way, there's also nothing I can really tell you here, because this will very greatly depend on picture to picture. So this is not really something I can give you any tips particularly, other than just trying it out and seeing for yourself. Alright, so I think after these very small adjustments here in the tonal curve, if I quickly show you from before to after, it's not a huge difference, but it does make the whole picture pop a little bit more, and at the end that's what this is all about. Then down with the HSL tool, I'm actually gonna quickly cover that one as well. Left to the hue you have this little pinpointer, just click on that and go over any major color in your picture. So for example, in a landscape that might be blue for the sky and green for the foreground, here it is really just blue. And even though there are some different colors here, it's really nothing major, and the HSL tool is just about fine-tuning your major colors, if that makes any sense. So anyways, I'm gonna hold down my left mouse button and just go down as well as up with it and just kind of see what it does to the picture. Now this will just slightly change your overall hue of the blues in this case, and I do think I'm gonna make it just a little bit darker by bringing it up. And the reason you wanna just use this little pinpointer here instead of the sliders is because a lot of times colors are just mixed out of different colors. So by having this little pinpointer, you will have a much more organic adjustment to the picture. Then you just want to do the exact same thing with the saturation. Also grab this little pinpointer down here and then see what it does to your picture. Once again, I do want to keep this relatively saturated and very blue, so I might even add a little bit here. And then lastly go over the luminance. This can have quite a big impact on dynamic as well. So let's also see what it does here. I don't think I'm gonna change too much there though, maybe even go a little bit into the minus. And once again, if you for example would have a landscape with greens and oranges for the sunset or whatever, then you can go over these colors, but here there's only really one major color, which is blue. So here's before the HSL tool adjustment, here's after. Really just fine tuning, very different from picture to picture, but I do think that this method makes a lot of sense. Then split toning is actually one of my favorite adjustments period, because here you can have such a huge impact to your picture. Now the first thing that I'm gonna do is go to highlights, go to this little box right next to it, and then first of all just go into all sorts of different colors. And what this will do is change the colors within the highlights of your picture. Now you can go for all sorts of looks, you can even go into the blues or let's say a little bit into the purples, red tones even. And there are definitely a lot of different colors that can work, but usually you want to go into the orange tones or in the yellow tones and just kind of fine tune your hue. And then go into the saturation and make sure you fine tune your overall saturation. And what this will do is just create a lot of differentiation from the highlights to the rest of your picture. Now you can do it as much as you want or as little as you want, but here I think I'm actually gonna add 100. And this was actually also a reason why I've added so much blue tones in the color temperature, because now I still have some of these blue tones left. But at the same time, the split toning or the warm tones in the split toning took over a very large part. I think it's much easier to just show you, here's before any split toning, here's after. As you can see, it mainly manifested or mainly had its effect on these kind of brightish spots. And these kind of darkerish spots in the blues right here, in the dark parts of the clouds, are still relatively blue. So it's absolutely amazing to use this tool to create differentiation. And I mean, it's a huge impact, really. It's very rare that it will have a huge impact like in this picture. Once again, before any split toning and after. Really huge, so much differentiation, so much more interesting. And once again, I still managed to retrieve and still have all of these blue tones at the same time. Then down here you also have the shadows, which essentially make the exact same thing, just with the shadow areas. And this is not necessarily as big of a deal, it doesn't really work that well, but you can still try out some different looks. Now oftentimes I will add a little bit of blues in the shadows, but I really don't think it's needed here. I absolutely love the look how it is. So let's see, do I even want to add a little bit of warm tones within the blues? I really don't, I think that will ruin the mood. You know what, maybe I actually will go into the blues and just add a tad bit of saturation, really nothing close to the 100% that I had here in the highlights. And from before to after any split toning, it's really a huge difference in this particular photo and I absolutely love it. Then down here at the detail tools, even though I shot this picture at the ISO 100, I still shot it with a Canon 18-55 kit lens and a Canon 600D, which is really not good in terms of dynamic range or noise at all. So you can see here we do have quite a bit of noise, really mostly color noise luckily, but I do have to change some of these settings right here. Also it was shot at f16, so it's not really super sharp, especially combined with a very unsharp kit lens, but it still makes a very good picture for a small print or online displaying. Alright, I'm gonna zoom in 1:1 here again, and first thing I'm gonna do is just bring the color slider to the right by 100. And what this will do is get rid of the color noise in your picture, and I'm not quite sure, if you're gonna watch this in full HD, you're really gonna see a huge difference, especially in this area right here. If I bring that to the right, it makes it look so much cleaner, it practically removes all of the color noise, and it's such an amazing tool. It doesn't have any bad impact at all. As you can see with the overall color, it doesn't change it at all. It really just removes that nasty and very ugly color noise, which is absolutely amazing. Then noise reduction is a thing that I don't really like as much as color noise reduction, because as I bring the noise reduction to the right, it will really reduce the detail and the overall sharpness by a lot. In return, it does get rid of some of the noise, but honestly, I really don't like it. I really hate to add it, but in this picture, I think it's almost necessary, so I'm just gonna add the least amount that I can, and really want to make sure that it's not too crazy in terms of the reduction of the detail and sharpness. Then let's go into the sharpness lastly, just add a little bit of sharpness, anywhere from 50 to 70 works most of the times, and then zooming out again, holding down the Alt or CMD key on a Mac and just bring the mask into the right, making sure you don't have anything selected that you don't want sharpened, because that will just introduce noise in the non-textured surfaces. Detail tool mostly has an effect if you will print your picture, but even with online displaying, it is oftentimes visible. For example here, it is noticeably sharper and noticeably cleaner. Then let's go down to the lens corrections. Here you just want to remove the chromatic aberration. That will get rid of any of the purple and green fringing on the high contrast edges, if there are any. And you also want to enable profile corrections, and of course choose your lens, and that will just fix the distortion of your lens. So before and after definitely works, very simple adjustment, and I like it. Then transform, this is actually a thing that I don't really use very much, but instead of transforming anything here or correcting anything in terms of the perspective of the lines and the shapes, I'd rather actually go into the cropping tool and just make sure that my horizon is straight, because I can see that the bridge right here doesn't look super straight, so I'm just gonna make sure that it looks good, press enter, and that's pretty much job done. From my experience, the transform tool only really works if you have an architecture or a house right in front of you. If you have it kind of to the side, it will just mess up everything and it just doesn't work really. So then down here at the effects you do have vignetting, and vignetting is a very powerful tool to create additional interest towards the center and less towards the edges. So what I'm gonna do here is add some vignetting. I'm just gonna add a crazy amount right here for the sake of showing you the other two sliders. And the other two sliders are the midpoint sliders. This is what just adjusts the midpoint and pretty much how much vignetting you have in your picture. And then also the feather, which just adjusts the feather and the smoothness, which of course makes it look a lot more natural and organic as you bring that to the right. So I'm gonna bring the amount to much more realistic and much more feasible value. You really don't have to go crazy here, just a little bit of vignetting often works the best. And if I show you from before to after, it is noticeably a little bit more attention towards the center, while at the same time not completely blowing the picture. Alright, I know this is gonna be a very long and in-depth tutorial and video, but I really think it is worth here because I wanted to show you every single step from start to finish and every single tool, and also just explain some of these things if you're curious or you're just starting with Lightroom. Anyways, down here at the camera calibration you have profiles, and you just want to go through all of these profiles. What this will do is change the hues, the colors, and the overall appearance of your picture, and it's very dependent on photo to photo as well as your liking, so there's absolutely no way I could tell you where to go exactly here. In about 50% of the pictures it will actually have quite a big difference, but in some pictures just the dope standard will work the best no matter what. And honestly here, I do think that the dope standard just works the best in my opinion. Camera neutral isn't too bad either, but it's just kind of too flat, too bright almost. And camera standard is almost a little bit too dull. So it's just gonna be a dope standard for this picture, but in some photos it can really have a huge impact, so you absolutely want to make sure that you play around with these. By the way, you could also play around with them at the very start, and not just at the end, but I tend to prefer to do it towards the end. Alright, so now to the primary color sliders, which are the very last global adjustments before I finally go into the local adjustments, which is really gonna be the fun part. Here you just wanna go through all of these sliders, and the thing is, if you change the red, for example, it will also have an effect on the blues and the greens, so you just kind of wanna play around with them. Once again, very different from picture to picture. And there's absolutely nothing I can explain you. Just in most cases it doesn't really work to go too far. For example here, just a little bit into the minus works just fine. And then you also automatically have the saturation that you can play around with. In this particular case, I think I might even go a little bit into the minus. I hope this isn't lagging, because this is always a very laggy and very choppy task. I'm actually just gonna fast forward real quick with these sliders and jump right back once I'm done. Okay, finally done with the global adjustments and the primary color sliders. Here's before any of these and here's after. Really such a minor adjustment, but once again, this is mainly about to show you the different tools and really show you everything, rather than just show you what is very impactful and very important. Before we go into the local adjustments, let's just quickly take a look at the before and after so far. And it's quite a big difference already. You know, kind of dark pictures like this don't really get as much recognition or as much attention most of the time as very bright sunset pictures. But if you print that in a very small print because the quality isn't great for a huge print, I think it would actually already look pretty good, especially in the clouds here. You have so much more color differentiation from blues to light blues to almost orange tones here. It's really hugely different. And also in terms of the foreground, it's very dark still, just has the right exposure. So I already like this picture quite a bit, but there's still a lot more to be done. Alright, so let's go into the local adjustments, and here you have three major things. First would be graduated filter, then you have the adjustment brush, and lastly what I like to use is the Radial filters. And with the graduated filters, you pretty much want to adjust everything in your picture that is very big, that you pretty much want to add a very large adjustment to it. For example, here in the foreground, I'm just going to add a filter, hold down shift so I get a perfectly straight filter, and just reduce the exposure a little bit. And the reason for that, just gonna fine tune the actual feather, the actual smoothness gradient, and just make sure it looks natural. And the reason for that is so it acts as an additional sort of vignetting, but just for the bottom, and it really helps to close out the picture. Once again, less attention here and more towards the center of the photo, and I really think that actually works. And I might do actually, let me try here on the left of the sky, if that will work as well. Maybe just on the very top actually, so it's great about Lightroom, of course, that you can just move around these filters and of course try out a whole bunch of different things, and if it's nothing then you can just remove it and delete it. But here, I do think I'm actually gonna add a little bit more into the minus exposure just for the top. And then another thing that I like to do is go over one side of my picture. For example, in this case that will be the right side right here, and just add a very big graduated filter with a very soft edge, and then go into the minus exposure just a little bit, maybe a fifth of a stop, maybe not even that, and then grab another one after that, a new one right here, and drag it in parallel over your picture, and then go over into the plus exposure, really just a little bit. It might seem a little bit unintuitive at first to go into the minus exposure for the top part right here and then go into the plus exposure on also the left part, which is also covered by the minus exposure right here. But the filter right here is really just about the entire side of the picture, which is a very, very broad adjustment, as well as the other one with the minus exposure over the right side. And the top filter right here is really just to close out the top. And so it's mostly vignetting and closing out these two filters. And then these two very big filters are just kind of to enhance the overall lighting scheme in a very, very subtle way. So here's before any graduated filters, here's after. It's actually quite amazing what kind of difference it can have. Even though this isn't, you know, a huge impact as I had it in some other pictures, it is still quite a huge difference from before to after. It looks much more interesting and a lot more differentiating from the left to the right side of the picture. Really, really huge. Then the next thing would be adjustment brush, and you want to use the adjustment brush for anything that you want a very large adjustment on, but you cannot use the graduated filters because it is not on a side or an edge. So let's say, for example, I would want to make this entire building right here a bit darker. I would want to do this with the adjustment brush, and you know, this is of course just a very sloppy job with way too much minus exposure. But just so you kind of get the idea of what I would use the adjustment brush for. But in this picture, there's really no such thing, so I'm just gonna leave that out and go straight away into the Radial filters. And the Radial filters, I know it already, we're gonna spend a lot of time here, because I use these for the dodge and burning. And dodge and burning, of course, is making individual parts either darker or brighter. If you would like to learn more in depth about that, I'm gonna link a video in the description. But what it pretty much does is complexify your lighting scheme of the overall picture by making certain parts a little bit darker, making certain parts especially a little bit brighter, and it really has a huge difference. So for the start, you want to make sure that your feather is at 100 and that you invert the mask. And that is just so you only adjust within the filter itself. So if I would add exposure right here, it just adds exposure within the filter rather than outside of the filter. And then also feather to 100 because it makes it look very soft. As you can see here, feather at 0, of course, it looks completely unnatural. But as I go more towards the right, it looks more and more organic. And by the way, this is also a good illustration here. As you can see, the filter itself is fairly big, but the only adjustment, or the actual adjustment itself, is fairly small. It's really just in the middle right here and then spreading very, very softly towards the edges. So always be aware of that while I show you the dodge and burning, because at the start it can seem a little bit weird if I stack them over one another, but most of the times that is just because the actual effect is much smaller than the filter looks like with the radius right here. Alright, so let's actually get started with the minus exposure first. Now usually I start with the plus exposure, but in this picture there's gonna be so much room for plus exposure that I'd rather just have the minus exposure right out of the way so I can focus on the plus exposure at the end fully. The minus exposure is pretty much to enhance already dark areas. So what I'm gonna do here is zoom in 1 to 2 into the picture, so I have a little bit more detail, but at the same time I'm not too close. And for example here, this house could just use a little bit minus exposure with minus blacks. And the reason for that is you still want some differentiation within, for example, houses right here. You still want the side to be a bit darker than the other, and by right click and duplicating the filters you can just drag it over another area. And you always want to make sure that you make it look natural, you adjust the sliders and not make it look overdone. And, you know, this is a very difficult thing to really, you know, get your head on at the first, because it seems very random and not very controlled at first. But once you get to know dodge and burning, you've watched maybe an in-depth tutorial, and you've done it on a few pictures and tried out all sorts of different looks and stuff, it really starts to make sense. So if I quickly show you just before we're done, anywhere near done, the dodge and burning from before to after, it just makes certain areas a little bit darker while at the same time not affecting a huge area. So once again, from before to after, it's not a huge difference, but it definitely helps. And once again, negative exposure usually doesn't have as big of a difference as the plus exposure, but it is still worth to add just for some additional differentiation from dark to bright, as well as some additional contrast. Then I'm also going to make this part a little bit darker, right click and duplicate, and you could also go a lot more in depth about this one and really spend, you could spend an hour on dodge and burning, but usually around 5 to 15 minutes it's much more reasonable and much more realistic. You can of course also make it much faster, but especially if you have a picture like this where you really have so much different things going on, so many different textures and structures, then you want to plan in a little bit of time for dodge and burning. And trust me, it is worth it. The minus exposure really is nowhere near as impactful as the plus exposure. So I'm going to finish up with the minus exposure here, maybe just see where there are some other filters needed. Right click, duplicate, drag it over another spot. You could also do that with the front slash key, but I just prefer to do it with the right click and duplicate way. So let's see, is there anything else I want to add in terms of minus exposure? I don't think there is, so let's zoom out again and just quickly see where we are right now. Come on, Lightroom. It's lagging already. I really hope that this doesn't lag with the recording. But here's before any minus exposure, here's after. It might seem almost a little bit spotty at first, but believe me, it's really valuable to have this differentiation and these kind of very darkish parts in just very selective and very small areas, because that will make your picture look interesting, dynamic, differentiating, contrasty, and all of that in a very subtle way. Once again, dodge and burning is a really complex and complicated thing at first, so I'd really suggest you to play around with it yourself and maybe also watch the in-depth tutorial. So then let's go into the other plus exposure dodge and burning, and for that I usually like to mix plus exposure a little bit with plus whites. This is very important. And that is actually pretty much it. You could also add color to it. I'm not quite sure if I want to do it in this picture. Let's just try it without any colors for now. And okay, so before I even add any, you just kind of want to look at your overall lighting of your picture. So for example here, if I zoom in and if Lightroom loads again, so you have all of these spots that are really just hit by light, and they are sometimes very, very subtle. You know, you won't even really notice them until you actually actively look for them. For example, this entire bridge right here is hit by the light, this top part of these houses. Then you have this line of the train, of course. Then you have these top parts of the railroad tracks. Then you have, for example, this train right here, which is a little bit brighter. Then you have all of these facades of the buildings. You really have so many different spots where light is just hitting very subtle. And the whole idea of dodge and burning is just to exaggerate a little bit that lighting and darkness scheme to create even more additional interest, differentiation, and complexification. Alright, so I'm gonna add a little bit of dodge and burning here. First of all, definitely with this train right here. And if I just actually show you from before that one, this is by the way with the black or the dark filters, and after, you can see there's really a huge difference here, and I'm gonna do it relatively quick. I don't want to make this video more longer than it really has to be, even though it is super long already. I really think it is at the end still kind of concise, considering that I show you pretty much all of Lightroom within a single video, and I assume if you've watched this far, then you enjoy these very long and very in-depth explanations of every single slider, and I appreciate you still watching. But once again, for example here, we do have the light hitting a little bit. I'm gonna right click and duplicate, maybe just on the top, you know, sometimes you have kind of a dull area, even if it's just very small, and you kind of can complexify that. And dodge and burning, once again, it's a really science for itself that I certainly have not mastered, but it's, you know, you will get better by doing it more and just looking at more pictures and just kind of seeing the fine tuning of that. And I really think that this is one of the best pictures to illustrate dodge and burning on, because there are so many different very small parts that are hit by the light, and they're also very dark shadows at the same time. So if I just right click and duplicate, maybe just on the top here, you know, a little bit more exposure. And you technically always want to make sure that you adjust the sliders with every single filter, so you at the end have the best possible look, although it can be quite tough to do that with a picture that requires so much dodge and burning. But once again, for example here, there's really just a small part on this bridge that is illuminated a little bit more than the rest, so let's actually make this filter even smaller. Then right click duplicate and drag it over another part. Let's actually make this lantern just a little bit bigger. I don't really want to make it look as if I turned it on or anything like that, but just make it a little bit brighter, you know, nothing crazy. Then let's go on to the right side of the picture, and this is probably going to take another few minutes, but I'm going to promise you it's going to be worth it to see the before and after with the dodge and burning, and hopefully you will just kind of be able to see what I mean with dodge and burning and kind of get the whole concept of, you know, creating differentiation and where it works, where it doesn't. So it's all about seeing the subtle differences in lighting and just kind of exaggerating that. Then let's just right click and duplicate here as well. Maybe just make, you know, this top part of the building a little bit brighter. And by the way, this is just doing dodge and burning while zoomed in, of course. Afterwards, I'm gonna do some more a little bit bigger rail filters rather than these very small ones. But I think, especially in a picture with so much detail and texture, it is absolutely worth to do that and take the time, zoom in, and do all of these very small rail filters. Right click duplicate, another one over here. Maybe this area is just a little bit boring, a little bit dull, so I'm gonna make it a bit bigger. Perhaps not go quite as far into the plus whites. Then let's bring it over towards the right again. See, right click, duplicate again, here just on the top, also a little bit boring. So just a bit more interest right there. And dodge and burning, really a huge thing. It has a huge impact, but it is also a little bit of work. And I think it is absolutely worth it. But you of course have to evaluate for yourself how much time you want to put in a picture. This is really a picture that is, you know, most pictures don't really have the need for so much dodge and burning. But let's add another few here. Maybe just on the top or on the bottom of this bridge even, just down here, and let's see, towards the left. Here I think it actually looks pretty good, so let's just zoom out again, and once again I'm not done with the dodge and burning. By the way, I'm really just trying to fill the time with talking about stuff while I'm doing this dodge and burning, because at the end, even though you kind of have to learn it by doing, it is still quite repetitive, and, you know, there's not so much you can explain at the end. So let's go from before any dodge and burning as of now and afterwards. So already it has really a huge difference, and especially if you look at these houses or this house complex right here, from before to after, it is really so much more differentiating and so much more interesting. And if you think there's a certain filter that looks a little bit too much, you can always adjust the values, drag it over another spot, and just adjust and fine-tune it. But once again, I just wanted to add some more big rail filters with plus exposure after adding all of the small ones. For example, this train right here, I think it could work quite well if I just would make it look as if some light would have spilled there. And once again, you don't want to make it look something like that, that is just completely unnatural. but just keep it within the natural reasoning. And the whole purpose, the whole reason of dodge and burning is to complexify your overall lighting, while at the same time not make it look unnatural. You pretty much want your viewer to not be really sure if you've added any dodge and burning, and if somebody doesn't know about dodge and burning, you don't want that person to say, "What have you done there? What is this weird spot of light?" It should all blend in with the rest and really, at the end look natural, organic, and so on. So let's add another one, a very big one right here. And by the way, if you stack over a big filter over some smaller filters, you can absolutely do that. Once again, just do it within reason and not make anything too much or too unnatural looking at the end. Let's just add a few more over here in the train, maybe a little bit plus exposure. I seem to have grabbed the minus exposure one, and then just make this a little bit more interesting as well. So let's see, come on Lightroom, you can do it. Just a few more filters. Alright, so make this a little bit longer as well. Then let's see, in terms of the overall picture, I think this actually works pretty well. Let's go into this one and just kind of reduce the actual effect here, because it does seem a little bit over the top. Same with this area right there, and that also looks a lot better afterwards. Alright, so you could also do dodge and burning within the sky. Actually, I'm gonna try to do that right here, just with a little bit of plus whites, actually, even without any exposure, and just try to make certain areas in the sky a little bit more pronounced. Here you really have to be careful though to not overdo it, but I think just a little bit could actually work. Alright, so is there anything else in terms of dodge and burning that I want to do? Maybe another one right here with a little bit of plus exposure, and just kind of make this whole area, this very large area, a little bit more interesting, a little bit brighter, and just have it sort of like that. Alright, so I think I'm actually done with the dodge and burning. You could even go further with it, but I think this works just fine. Maybe just another one right here. Kind of a smaller one with a little bit of plus exposure, just angle it. And dodge and burning, you always find another spot to add one, so it can be quite addictive. But here is before any dodge and burning, here's after. Keep in mind you see the direct comparison, so it might look a little bit spotty and a little bit overdone. But if you look at the picture for a while, then you will notice how much more complex, how much more interesting it seems, while at the same time still looking natural. So from before, very dull in comparison, and afterwards, very, very interesting, while at the same time still remaining this dark and gloomy overall mood. And once again, if you would have a filter that is perhaps a little bit too much, then you can of course always go back to it and just adjust this very filter. Yeah, just adjust this one as well. So I think that is pretty much it in terms of the whole dodge and burning especially. Let me go back to this one right here and just remove these two small ones over the bridge. I really don't think plus exposure works here. And sometimes you're just gonna notice something in the overall after adding all of the dodge and burning that you would think would work beforehand. But I am actually very, very happy with how that looks. So I'm gonna quickly remove this little dust or dirt spot right here with the spot removal tool. Always want to make sure that you're on heal if you do that, and just click over it, remove, and it should do a fine job. If not, then you might have to right click and select new source, or just front slash as well, but I think that works just fine. So I do think there are some last touches to be done. For example, I'm gonna add an adjustment brush just with a little bit of plus clarity. We're really nearing the end, and at the start I said I wanted to add some local clarity over just some areas. I think certain areas could actually benefit from it, for example right here, really just some smaller areas, pretty random actually, but there are certain structures and certain houses that are just working better with clarity than others, and I just want to create some differentiation within that as well. So let's just actually fine-tune the amount of the clarity as well, and I think around 30 works just fine. Here's before, here is after. Really a small impact, but while we're already so far into this video, I might as well show you all of the small differences as well. And with that said, let's go back to this filter right here. This really doesn't work with the plus exposure, so I'm gonna delete that. And with this one right here, it's still a little bit too dark, so I might even bring it just really a tiny bit into the minus exposure. And I'm gonna say that I'm done. I'm very happy with this picture. There's always more that you can do, but at some point you just have to call it quits, because this video is already very long, and I know that a lot of people enjoy these very long videos. I certainly understand it. But honestly, I feel it is almost a little bit repetitive if I do these long videos over and over. So the question to you actually is, would you like to see me do these very in-depth edits, but very fast, you know, without explaining these sliders and what they do, what the effect is, why I use them in combination with each other, but rather just minus 100, plus 100 here, because if I wouldn't be explaining everything super in detail, I could probably edit a photo like this in about 10-15 minutes. So it's just up to you whether you want to see me move around sliders without any explanation, or if you prefer these kind of videos. Also, of course, I could just make shorter videos and not go as in-depth about the dodge and burning or the different tools such as camera calibration, HSL tool, and so on. Anyways, I think it's time to go into the history and see where we started at. Look at this long history. I don't think I've ever had such a long history ever. Alright, so here's the import, the raw file, and it's a lot more darker, a lot more duller, and especially in terms of the color, but also in terms of the shadow detail. And the thing afterwards, not only does it look much more interesting, more differentiating, it actually looks a little bit too purplish. So let's go here into the hue in the camera calibration and just fine tune that. And yeah, I absolutely like that a lot better. So it's always, you know, worth to just kind of check from before to after to see an obvious difference that you might not even like. So once again, from before to after, let's just quickly see here, a lot darker, a lot more dull, and afterwards, it's really, I actually really like this picture. It's very differentiating. There's a lot of stuff going on, while at the same time, you still have this very dark, gloomy, very dramatic mood. And maybe I'm actually gonna go a little bit more into the minus exposure here at the end. Yeah, instead of the plus a fifth of a stop that I had previously, I'm just gonna bring that to 0, and that actually works really a lot better. But once again, I really am very happy with the picture. It looks a lot more differentiating. I mean, once again, these kind of dark pictures that are kind of more difficult to really see what is going on there, because it is not as obvious as a very bright picture. But if you're gonna print your picture and really look at it for a while, I think this is actually quite nice and quite good at the end. Thank you very much for watching, and I apologize if I made less sense towards the last 10 minutes and I kind of mumbled more, because there are really a lot of repetitive tasks and a lot of fine-tuning there, which there isn't really too much explaining to be done for that. But if you could let me know whether you would like to see me do more long and in-depth videos just like this one, or if you would enjoy shorter, maybe 10, 15, 20 minute videos that are really concise and just focused on the very high impact adjustments, rather than just going through all of these and HSL tool and stuff that barely has any adjustment to the picture, I think that would actually make more sense, but I know a lot of people really enjoy these long videos. Let me know in the comments down below, I would definitely hugely appreciate that. Anyways, that was it for this video. If you want to subscribe, then you can subscribe, you can share and all of that stuff, but I don't want to take away too much of your time anymore. Thank you once again very much for watching, and hopefully I'll catch you in the next one.